autumn of 1956. This was Cedar Hollow, a place abandoned yet alive.
By August of 1957, every potato field in Cedar Hollow stood skeletal, and stripped leaves chewed to lace the men staring at ruin from the edges of their own land. Every field but one. Behind a low willow fence at the cold end of the valley, 63 half-blind ducks waddled fat and slow between rows so green they looked painted on. The same neighbors who had laughed all spring now stood silent at the gate, hats in their hands, faces gone soft with the particular shame of people who have been wrong about something they were certain of. Nellie Pickard, 26 years old, mud to her elbows and a willow switch in her hand, did not come out to meet them. She had nothing left to prove to a valley that had spent a season calling her a fool. Behind her, the ducks worked the rows the way her mother had once worked an orchard patient, and homely, and exactly right. There was a letter in her apron pocket, folded soft from rereading. It had been written in November of 1953 by a woman 3 years dead, and it ended with a single line that had carried Nellie through the worst summer of her life. A thing don't have to be pretty to be worth keeping. It only has to be good at the one thing nobody else can do. This is how she made them remember her mother's name. The first time Nellie Pickard saw the farm, that would either save her or break her. It was October of 1956, and the maples on the ridge behind the house were the color of a slow fire dying out. She stood at the end of the rutted lane with her husband Thaddeus beside her, and they did not speak for a long while. There was nothing to say that the land had not already said. 40 acres of stubborn Vermont ground a low farmhouse with a sagging porch, a leaning barn with one wall braced by a cedar pole somebody had nailed up in a hurry years before. A creek ran thin along the western edge, gray as old pewter under a sky that promised rain. The previous owner had walked away from the place in the spring after his wife died, and the bank had been carrying the note ever since, eager to be done with it. It was cheap because nobody else wanted it. That was the only reason the Pickards could afford to stand there at all. Thaddeus was 31 years old, broad through the shoulders, with the steady, patient face of a man who had learned young that the world did not reward hurrying. He wore his cap pulled low over his left ear because he could not hear from that side anymore. Not since the slate mine collapsed at the Hollow Creek Quarry in the spring of 1953 and took 3 men down with it. He had been one of the lucky ones. He had crawled out coughing slate dust, dragging his foreman by the belt, and he had spent 14 months afterward in a kind of slow gray fog before he met Nellie Thatcher at a church supper in Rutland and found his way back to himself. He had no business being a farmer. He had spent his whole working life underground, breaking stone, and the only land he had ever known was the kind that fell on you. But Nellie wanted a farm, and Thaddeus had learned in the dark after the collapse that he wanted whatever Nellie wanted because she was the thing that had pulled him out of the gray. She stood beside him now, 26 years old, small and dark-haired, her hands jammed deep in the pockets of a man's wool coat she had bought at a church sale for 40 cents. She was not a pretty woman in the way the magazines wanted women to be pretty. Her face was too sharp and her eyes too watchful. But she had a way of looking at a thing, anything a leaf or a sky or a person, that made the thing feel seen. She had inherited that look from her mother. Cora Thatcher had been famous in 3 counties for the look. Before the look had gone into the ground with her, in the cold January of 1954, Nellie turned the look on the farm now. She walked the lane, slowly stopping every few yards, crouching to crumble a handful of soil between her fingers, rising to study the ridgeline, the angle of the southern slope, the way the wind moved through the dry corn stubble in the lower field. Thaddeus followed her at a distance and let her work. He had learned not to interrupt her when she was seeing. After a long time, she came back to where he stood. "This is it," she said. "You sure?" "The soil is tired, but it's not dead. The man who had it didn't know how to talk to it. And you do. My mother did. She taught me some." Thaddeus looked at the leaning barn and the sagging porch and the creek that ran too thin and the sky that promised rain. "All right," he said. They bought it that afternoon for $940, which was every cent they had in the world after the mine settlement and the years of Nellie sewing dress shirts for the Montgomery Ward catalog in a back room of her aunt's house in Rutland. They signed the papers in the bank president's office in the village of Cedar Hollow, and the bank president, a thin man named Mr. Crowley with ink-stained fingers, looked at them across his desk for a long moment before he handed over the deed. "You're young," he said. "Yes," Nellie said. "That land has broken older folks." "I know. Your husband was at the quarry." "Yes." Mr. Crowley nodded slowly. He had grown up in the hollow. He knew about the collapse. He knew about Cora Thatcher, too, though he did not say her name. "There's a man here named Harlan Booth," he said. "He sells seed potatoes to half the county. You'll want to introduce yourselves to him soon. He has opinions about how things ought to be done in this valley. If you cross him without meaning to, you'll find the road harder than it needs to be." "Thank you," Nellie said. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that she had heard the name Harlan Booth before. She had heard it on her mother's deathbed in the cold winter house in Rutland, when Cora had been coughing blood into a handkerchief and trying to tell her daughter something important and not quite managing to get it out. Booth, her mother had said. "Don't trust." Booth. That had been the last clear word her mother spoke before the fever took her under. They moved into the farmhouse in the second week of October, with the maples turning to ash on the ridge and the first hard frost already silvering the grass at dawn. They had a wagon load of furniture, 2 trunks of clothes, a wood stove that smoked a cast-iron skillet that had belonged to Thaddeus's grandmother, and a small wooden box bound with twine that held Cora Thatcher's papers. Nellie set the box on the mantel and did not open it for a long time. Some grief is too big to look at directly. It has to be approached the way you approach a wounded animal, sideways, with patience, with a great deal of waiting. The first winter on the farm was the kind of winter that teaches a person what they are made of. The wood stove smoked because the chimney was bad, and they spent the first hard week of November rebuilding it with mortar, Thaddeus mixed in a bucket on the porch, his bare hands cracking in the cold. The barn roof leaked in 3 places, and they patched it with tar paper and tin scavenged from the dump in Burlington. The creek froze solid by Christmas, and Thaddeus had to break the ice every morning with an axe so the chickens could drink. They had bought 12 hens and a rooster, and 4 of the hens died of cold in January, and Nellie cried over them because she had not yet learned to be the kind of farm woman who could lose a hen without crying. By February, the snow was 4 feet deep along the north wall of the house, and they were down to their last $100, and Thaddeus's tie was hurting him again, the way it always hurt him when the cold pressed in. He never complained. He just got quieter, and Nellie learned to read the silence. In the middle of the worst week, with the wind screaming down from the ridge and the windows rattling in their frames, Nellie finally took the wooden box down from the mantel and opened it. Inside were her mother's papers, letters in Cora's slanted hand, recipes for apple butter and herbal poultices, seed packets carefully labeled in pencil, a pressed sprig of lavender from the summer of 1947, and at the bottom of the box, wrapped in oilcloth, a leather-bound notebook with a brass clasp. Nellie did not open the notebook that night. She held it in her lap by the lamp while Thaddeus dozed in the chair across from her, and she looked at the clasp for a long time, and then she put the notebook back in the box and closed the lid. She was not ready. She could feel her mother very close in that moment, closer than she had felt her in 3 years, and she could not bear to read whatever was in those pages, while the wind was screaming and the wood stove was guttering, and her husband was sleeping with his cap pulled down over his bad ear. Some doors, she understood, you open only when you are strong enough to walk through them. She was not strong enough yet. She put the box back on the mantel. Spring came late and slow that year. The snow did not finish going until the 2nd week of April, and the ground was so wet that Thaddeus could not get the plow into the lower field until the 1st of May. They had 3 acres they meant to put into potatoes, because potatoes kept through winter and sold steady, and a young farm needed a sure thing more than it needed a dream. Nellie knew potatoes from her mother's garden in Rutland. She knew how to read the soil for them, and how to set the eyes, and how to hill the rows. But 3 acres was not a garden. 3 acres was a serious crop, and she had never grown a serious crop before. It was Thaddeus who said they ought to ask Harlan Booth for his advice on the seed. "The bank man said he sells to half the county," Thaddeus said over supper one cold April night. "He'll know what does best in this ground." Nellie did not answer right away. She thought about her mother's last word. Booth. Don't trust. But she had not been able to bring herself to tell Thaddeus about that last word. Cora had been delirious by then, and the word might have meant nothing, and Nellie had not wanted to make her husband carry a feud whose shape she did not even know. So she had kept it to herself the way she had kept the notebook closed on the mantel. And now the silence had grown into something she could not easily reverse. "All right," she said. "We'll go see him." They went on a Saturday morning in the second week of April, driving the old wagon over the ridge road to the eastern side of the valley, where the Booth place sat on the best ground in Cedar Hollow. 260 acres of bottomland along the river, with a white-painted farmhouse 3 stories tall and a dairy barn so big it could have housed a church. There was a smaller barn behind it that Harlan Booth used as his seed house, and that was where they found him, sorting potato eyes at a long oak table with 2 young men working under him. Harlan Booth was 58 years old that spring, tall and lean as a length of split rail, with iron gray hair combed back from a high forehead and pale blue eyes that did not blink as often as other people's eyes. He wore a clean denim coat and clean denim trousers and clean leather boots, even at work in the seed house. And when the Pickards came through the door, he set down his knife and rose to his full height and regarded them without smiling. "You'd be the young couple from the Crowley place," he said. "We bought it in October," Thaddeus said. "Pickard, this is my wife, Nellie." Harlan Booth's pale eyes moved to Nellie and stopped there. They did not move again for a long moment. Something passed behind them that Nellie could not read, a flicker, a recognition, a thing remembered and put away again. He took it in the dark hair, the watchful face, the small, sharp chin. Then he looked away, and the moment was past. "Pickard," he said. "From Rutland." "Yes, and before Rutland." "My mother's people were from the Hollow," Nellie said. "She was raised on the old Thatcher place at the bend of the river. It's gone now. The house burned in '49. "I know which place," Harlan Booth said. He said it the way a man says a thing he wishes he did not have to say. Then he sat down again at his table and picked up his knife and went back to sorting potato eyes. And he did not look at Nellie again the whole time they were in the seed house. He told them what varieties did best in their kind of ground. He told them how to set the eyes, and how deep to plant, and how to hill. He gave them good advice, plain and useful. The advice of a man who had spent his life growing potatoes and knew what he was talking about. He sold them 3 bushels of certified seed at a fair price. He shook Thaddeus's hand at the door, but he did not look at Nellie. Not once. And when they were driving home down the ridge road with the seed bushels in the back of the wagon, Thaddeus said quietly, "He knew your mother." "Yes," Nellie said. "You want to tell me about that? I don't know enough yet to tell." Thaddeus nodded and let it lie. He was a patient man. He had learned in the dark, after the collapse, that some answers had to be waited for. They planted the 3 acres in the second week of May. They worked from before dawn until after dark, the 2 of them alone, Thaddeus driving the old gray mare down the rows with the plow, while Nellie followed behind, dropping the seed pieces and pressing them in with her heel. By the end of the second day, her back was a single bar of fire, and her hands were blistered raw, but the rows were straight, and the seed was in, and the ground was warm enough now that the rain would do its work. It rained for 3 days after they finished. A soft, warm rain, the kind that wakes seed up. By the end of the week, the first pale shoots were coming through the soil, and Nellie walked the rows in the cool of the morning and counted them, and her heart lifted in her chest in a way it had not lifted in years. This was the moment she thought when a farm became a farm. Not when you bought it, not when you moved in, but when the first thing you planted came up out of the ground green and reaching, and you knew that the land had decided for now to let you try. She did not know yet what was coming. She did not know about the eggs that would appear on the undersides of the leaves in 3 weeks' time, small and orange and clustered, laid in numbers that no one in the valley had ever seen. She did not know about the ducks that would be advertised for sale at the feed store in the village by the end of May. She did not know about the long summer ahead, and the laughter at the fence line, and the night the fox would come, and the things she would learn about her dead mother that she had spent 3 years not knowing. She knew only that the rows were green and the rain was soft, and her husband was strong beside her, and the farm was theirs. It was the last week of May when she found the first eggs. She was walking the middle row of the eastern field in the slant light of early morning, a tin pail of milk on her hip, taking a shortcut back from the spring house to the kitchen. She had been on that path 100 times that month and had thought nothing of it. But that morning, for no reason she could name, she stopped halfway down the row and crouched and turned over a leaf at the base of a young potato plant. There they were, a small clutch of bright orange dots no bigger than poppy seeds packed in a tight cluster along the central vein of the leaf. Nellie set the milk pail down very carefully in the dirt of the row. She knew what they were. Anyone who had grown up in Cora Thatcher's garden knew what they were. Colorado potato beetle eggs. Each cluster of orange dots was 40 or 50 larvae waiting to hatch, and each larva would grow into a beetle that would lay another cluster, and the math of it, once it got going, was the kind of math that ended fields. She turned over another leaf. There were eggs there, too. She turned over a third. Eggs. She walked 20 paces down the row, turning leaves. Every 4th or 5th plant had a clutch. The infestation was not yet thick, but it was spreading, and it was early, far earlier than the old-timers in the valley would have expected the beetles to be laying. Nellie stood up slowly in the row. The milk pail sat at her feet. The morning sun was coming over the ridge now, slanting yellow through the young leaves. Somewhere in the woods, a thrush was singing the same 5 notes over and over. She knew standing there that her year had just changed shape. She walked back to the house, slowly carrying the pail, and she did not tell Thaddeus what she had seen until after breakfast, because she wanted to think first. She wanted to look at the problem from several angles before she put it into words, because once a thing was in words, it could not easily be taken back, and her husband would worry, and worry would not help. She sat at the kitchen table while he ate, and she turned the problem over in her mind. She thought about poisons. Lead arsenate was what the old folks had used, and Paris green before that, but both were expensive and dangerous, and would not be enough against a hatch this early and this widespread. She thought about hand-picking. 2 pairs of hands could pick maybe an acre a day if they did nothing else. And once the larvae hatched and started feeding, you would lose the race in a week. She thought about what her mother had done in the bad year of 1947, when the beetles had been almost this bad in the Rutland garden. Cora had set out shallow pans of kerosene along the rows and knocked the beetles into them. It had worked, but Cora had been managing a garden of half an acre. 3 acres was different. She was still turning it over when Thaddeus pushed his plate back and looked at her across the table. "What is it?" he said. "Beetles," she said. "Eggs on the leaves. Early." He waited. "It's going to be bad. The whole valley is going to be bad. I could see 2 clutches on every 3rd plant out there, and we're not even into June. By the time the hatch finishes, there will be thousands of them on every plant." "How bad?" "Bad enough we lose the crop if we don't find a way." Thaddeus rubbed his jaw. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "What did your mother do?" "What she did won't scale," Nellie said. "Not to 3 acres, and there's no money for the chemicals that might." "Then we think of something else." Yes, that was Thaddeus. That was always Thaddeus. We think of something else. He did not panic, and he did not despair, and he did not insist that she find an answer before she had one. He simply trusted that an answer would be found because Nellie was the one looking, and Nellie's eye was the thing he trusted above all other things in the world. She loved him very hard in that moment. She did not say so. She just got up from the table and went out to walk the rows again because she did her best thinking with her hands on the leaves. It was Iona Whitcomb who told her about the ducks. Iona was the only person in Cedar Hollow who had come up the lane to meet them in those first weeks after they moved in. She had come in November with a basket of apple butter and dried herbs, and she had stood on the porch for a long time staring at Nellie before she spoke. Iona was 64 years old, a thin gray woman with eyes that had gone pale with cataracts, but could still see somehow more than most eyes could see. She had been Cora Thatcher's closest friend in the long years before Cora left the valley to marry Nellie's father, and she had loved Cora the way some women love a sister. When she had finally spoken on the porch that first November day, Iona had said only, "You have her face." Then she had pressed the basket into Nellie's hands and walked back down the lane without another word. She came back, though. Through the winter, she came every few weeks sometimes with food, sometimes with nothing at all, sometimes just to sit at the kitchen table and drink coffee and look at Nellie and say very little. She never spoke of Cora directly. Nellie understood after the 3rd or 4th visit that Iona was waiting for something. Permission, maybe, or a question, or a moment. It was Iona who came up the lane on the 3rd of June riding her old mule and stopped at the fence by the eastern field where Nellie was kneeling in the dirt turning leaves. "How bad?" Iona said without dismounting. 2 clutches every 3rd plant. Some plants have 4. and nothing to do about it. Not that I've thought of yet. Iona was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There's a man at the south end of the valley selling off a flock of ducks. The notice went up at the feed store yesterday. His operation failed last fall. The birds caught some kind of eye sickness from bad water, and most of them came out of it half blind. 63 of them. He's asking almost nothing because nobody wants them. A blind duck can't forage and can't herd and can't lay where you want it to lay. A blind duck is no use to anyone." Nellie stood up slowly in the row. Her hand was still cupped around a leaf with eggs on the underside. "Ducks eat beetles," she said. "Ducks eat anything that moves. A blind duck would eat them just the same if we could get it to where they were." "Yes." The two women looked at each other across the fence. The sun was high now, and the leaves were green, and the world was very quiet. "Where?" Nellie said. "South end of the valley, the old Marsden place. He's there till Friday, and then the bank takes the birds." Nellie nodded slowly. Her mind was already moving, building it, seeing it. The narrow lanes, the willow walls, the ducks confined to where the work was. 63 half-blind birds turned into the strangest, surest hands a Vermont potato field had ever known. It was ridiculous. It was completely ridiculous. The whole valley would laugh. She did not care. "Thank you, Iona." "Don't thank me yet. You'll be thanking me or cursing me by August. We don't know which." The old woman turned her mule and started back down the lane. Halfway to the gate, she stopped and looked back over her shoulder. "Nellie." "Yes. Your mother had ideas like this, big, strange ideas. She used to write them down in a book she kept by her bed. Did you ever find that book?" Nellie's hand tightened on the leaf. "There's a notebook in her papers," she said. "I haven't opened it yet." Iona looked at her for a long moment with the pale, clouded eyes. "You will when you're ready." Then she rode on down the lane. Nellie went alone to buy the ducks. Thaddeus's ear was hurting him that morning. A bad day, the kind where the pressure behind his left eye would not let him stand up straight, and Nellie told him to stay in bed. She drove the wagon by herself the 11 miles to the south end of the valley over the ridge and down through the pine woods and out into the flat, marshy bottoms where the failed Marsden place sat sagging in the June sun. The man who came out to meet her was older than she had expected. His name was Owen Marsden, and he had to be near 70, and he had the gray, hollowed face of a man who had watched everything he built come apart in slow motion. He took her money with hands that shook a little. He helped her load the slatted crates onto the wagon, 63 half-blind ducks muttering and shuffling and tilting their heads at sounds they could not place. When the last crate was loaded, he stood at the wagon's side and put a hand on the rail and looked at Nellie with watery eyes. "You ought to know something about these birds, missus." "What?" "They weren't sick. Not the way I told the feed store." She waited. "They came out of a research barn at Cornell last year. The university was running some kind of experiment on vision in poultry. Federal money. The money got cut in '56 and the program shut down overnight. They had nowhere to put the birds. A man I know in Ithaca brought them up to me in a truck and asked me to keep them quiet. I was supposed to grow them out and sell them as table birds. But word got around about the eye sickness, which was what we told folks, and nobody would buy them. And now the bank's got me anyway. Nellie looked at the crates. The ducks were quiet now, settled in the slats, their dull feathers gleaming faintly in the noon sun. "What kind of experiment?" she said. "I don't know. I never asked. The man in Ithaca said the birds were healthy in every way that mattered, just couldn't see far. He said they'd been raised in narrow pens since they were ducklings. He said they were used to working close ground." He paused.
"Mrs., if you tell folks in the valley where these birds came from, they'll burn you out. Cornell is one thing. Federal money is another. Folks around here after the war, they don't trust anything that came out of a government barn. Half of them will think the birds are radioactive. The other half will think they carry some kind of plague. Either way, you'll lose everything before August."
Nellie nodded slowly. She did not promise. She did not need to. The old man could see in her face that she understood.
"Why are you telling me?" she said. "Because you're young," he said, "and because I watched my wife die last fall in this house, and I am not going to send another farm down without at least telling the next one the truth about what's in the wagon. That's all. Get on home, missus. The birds are yours now."
She drove home in the long afternoon with the strange cargo behind her. And she did not stop in the village, and she did not stop at any neighbor's gate, and she did not tell Thaddeus what the old man had said. She put the ducks in the back pasture that first night, and she stood at the fence in the falling light, watching them shuffle and mutter in the strange new grass. 63 half-blind birds that had come up from a federal barn in Ithaca with a secret writing on their backs. And she understood that she had taken on more than a strategy against beetles. She had taken on a thing she would have to protect with silence. That night, she finally took her mother's notebook down from the mantel. Thaddeus was asleep in the bedroom, the bad ear pressed into the pillow. The kitchen was warm from the supper fire. Nellie sat at the table with the notebook in front of her, and the lamp turned low, and she ran her thumb over the brass clasp for a long time before she opened it.
The first page was dated April 1937. Cora would have been 28 years old.
Nellie did not read the whole notebook that night. She could not. She read 3 pages and had to close it because her chest was hurting too badly to go on. But in those 3 pages, she learned something she had not known. Her mother, in the spring of 1937, had been engaged to be married. Not to Nellie's father, not yet, to another man. A man whose name Cora had written in the careful slanted hand on the second page of the notebook, and then crossed out 3 times with hard, angry pencil strokes, the way a person crosses out a word they wish they could unwrite. You could still read the name through the crossings, Harlan Booth. Nellie sat at the kitchen table in the low lamplight and looked at the crossed-out name for a long time. Outside in the back pasture, 63 half-blind ducks were settling down for their first night on the Picard farm, and somewhere in the eastern field, on the undersides of the young potato leaves, the orange clutches of beetle eggs were quietly darkening the tiny lives inside them, coming on toward the morning when they would hatch all at once and the long summer would truly begin. Nellie closed the notebook. She put it back in the wooden box on the mantel.
She did not yet know how to carry what she had just learned, but she knew, standing alone in the warm kitchen, with her husband sleeping in the next room, and her dead mother's name on a crossed-out page, and her 63 strange birds muttering in the pasture, that the summer ahead of her was not going to be a summer about potatoes. It was going to be a summer about her mother, and about a man who had not looked at her once the whole time she had been in his seed house, because looking at her was looking at Cora Thatcher, and looking at Cora Thatcher was something Harlan Booth had spent 20 years trying not to do. She blew out the lamp. She went to bed. Outside, the ducks were quiet. The beetles were quiet. The whole valley was quiet under a sky pricked with hard, cold stars. But in the morning, the work would begin, and Nellie Picard, 26 years old, with mud already on her hands and her mother's crossed-out grief in her chest, would walk out into the eastern field at first light and start building the strangest machine the valley had ever seen. A machine made of willow and barrel hoops and 63 half-blind birds. A machine her mother had drawn in a notebook 3 years before she died, on a page Nellie had not yet found in the back of a leather binding with a brass clasp waiting. The sun came up over Cedar Hollow. The summer began. The hatch came on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June, and it came the way Cora Thatcher had once said, "Such things come all at once the way weather breaks." Nellie went out at first light to walk the rows, and the undersides of the leaves were alive. Where there had been clutches of orange eggs the day before, there were now soft red larvae, pinhead, small glistening climbing. They moved with the slow blind hunger of newborn things. By the time the sun was full over the ridge, the first of them had reached the leaf surfaces and begun to feed, and where one larva fed 100 more were coming up behind it. She stood in the row and counted what she could count. She gave up at the 4th plant. The math was no longer the kind of math that could be done with a finger and a notebook. The math was the kind you felt in your stomach. She walked back to the house slowly. Thaddeus was at the kitchen table eating cold biscuits with butter and reading the same line of the Burlington paper over and over because his ear was hurting again and the pain made the words slide around. "They hatched," she said. He looked up. "All at once? All at once." He set the paper down. "Then we start the lanes today." Today. They had been building the lanes for 2 weeks already, in every hour they could steal from the other work of the farm. Nellie had laid them out on her hands and knees with a length of twine and a sharpened stick, walking the eastern field row by row, marking where the willow walls would run and where the gates would open
and where the shallow water pans would sink into the ground. Thaddeus had cut willow from the creek bottom in great green armloads, and Nellie had woven the long, supple withes into low fencing the way her mother had once shown her to weave a hive skeep, the work coming back into her hands as if it had been waiting there all along. They had scavenged old barrel hoops from the dump in Burlington and bent the willow around them at the corners. They had laid scrap boards on edge in the longer runs. Gray weathered boards Thaddeus salvaged from the leaning barn, and they had braced them with cedar stakes driven deep into the wet June ground. It was the strangest architecture the valley had seen. Long, shallow lanes running between every other row of potatoes' knee-high walls of board, and woven willow gates at the ends of each run made of barrel hoop bent into a half-moon and laced with green withe. From a distance, it looked like some patient child's enormous toy laid out in the dirt. A kind of soft maze with no center and no exit. Only the rows and the lanes and the rows again going on 3 acres deep into the eastern field. Bert Halloran had been the first to see it. Bert was 47 that year, the Pickards' nearest neighbor to the east, a man with a long, sad face and a short, sharp tongue who could not for the life of him keep a joke to himself. He had ridden past the field on his way to the village in the second week of building, and he had reined his horse in at the gate and sat staring for a long time, and then he had ridden on to the feed store and told everyone what he had seen. By the next afternoon, the Pickard farm had visitors. They came in 2s and 3s, leaning on the fresh willow fence, watching Nellie and Thaddeus on their hands and knees in the dirt, weaving and bracing and digging. "What is it you're farming over there, Pickard?" Bert called out the first day, grinning. "Potatoes or pretzels?" "Bit of both," Thaddeus said, and kept working. "And what's the trick to it? You growing something special between the rows." "Ducks," Nellie said without looking up. Bert blinked. "Ducks? 63 of them. In the lanes." "Yes." Bert looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed a high, startled laugh and slapped his thigh and turned his horse and rode straight back to the village. And by supper time, the joke had been told in every kitchen on the east side of Cedar Hollow. The young Pickard couple was building a duck circus in their potato field. The Pickard woman thought ducks would save her crop. The Pickard man, poor fellow with the bad ear, had let his wife talk him into it. Harlan Booth came on the 5th day. He did not lean on the fence and laugh like the younger men. He rode up the lane on a tall bay gelding and dismounted at the gate and walked slowly to the edge of the field with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets. He stood there a long time, looking at the lanes, looking at the woven willow, looking at the gates of barrel hoop. He did not speak. Nellie was on her knees 20 yards down the nearest lane, lashing a hoop into place, and she felt him before she saw him. She did not stand up. She did not turn around. She finished the lashing slowly and tied it off with a square knot. And only then did she rise from the dirt and walk down the lane to where he stood. "Mr. Booth? Mrs. Pickard." He did not look at her face. He looked at the lanes. "I came to see for myself."
The talk in the village is something to hear.
I imagine.
You spent good money on blind ducks. Spent very little money on them. And built all this.
Yes. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said in the same flat voice,
Your mother used to do this.
Nellie waited. Not with ducks, with apples. In the bad summer of '48, when the fire blight came down the valley and took out every orchard between here and Burlington. She came to a meeting of the Agricultural Council. I sat on that council then. I sit on it still. She brought a drawing on a piece of butcher paper. A grafting method she said she had worked out herself, an old French rootstock crossed with the local Baldwin. She said it would save the orchards. She wanted the council to fund a trial.
And the council said no.
The council said no. Nellie said nothing. She did it anyway, on her own ground. The next summer her trees stood, and every other orchard in the valley was a stand of dead sticks. She was right. I was on the council that told her she was wrong, and she was right, and she was decent enough never to say so to my face. He turned his head slowly and looked at Nellie for the first time. The pale blue eyes were not unkind. They were something worse than unkind. They were tired. Mrs. Pickard, ask Iona Whitcomb how that summer ended for your mother. Ask her about the winters after. Ask her why your mother walked to Rutland in the snow of '54 when she had the fever. Ask her who would not lend her a wagon. Then come back and tell me whether you still want to build a duck circus in this valley. He did not wait for an answer. He turned and walked back to his horse and mounted and rode down the lane without looking back. Nellie stood in the dirt of the lane for a long time after he was gone. The June sun was hot on her shoulders, and the willow walls cast their thin shadows down the rows, and somewhere in the back pasture, a duck was muttering in its sleep. Then she walked into the house and washed her hands and put on her one clean apron and walked the 2 miles down the road to Iona Whitcomb's cabin at the bend of the creek. Iona was on the porch shelling early peas into a tin bowl. She looked up when Nellie came around the corner of the house, and her pale, clouded eyes went very still. "He came to you," she said. "Yes." "What did he say?" "He told me to ask you about the summer of '48 and the winters after, and why my mother walked to Rutland in the snow of '54. Iona set the bowl of peas aside and folded her hands in her lap and looked out over the creek for a long moment. The water was low and clear in the June light. A kingfisher was working the shallows at the far bank. "Sit down, child." Nellie sat. "Your mother came to Cedar Hollow when she was 16 years old," Iona said, "to live with her aunt after her own mother died. That would have been the autumn of 1925. She was tall and dark and serious, and she had a way of looking at things that made the old men in the village uncomfortable, because she would look at a thing they had been looking past for 40 years, and she would see it new. The boys in the valley fell over each other for her. She did not seem to notice. She was waiting for someone who would talk to her about the things she actually cared about, which were apples and bees and weather and the names of stars. Iona's voice was steady and slow. She had the sound of a woman telling a story she had told to herself many times in the dark. Harlan Booth was 28 years old then. He had just come into his father's farm, the biggest place in the valley, and he was the most eligible young man between here and Montpelier. He met your mother at a barn dance in the autumn of 1936. He courted her for 6 months. He asked for her hand in the spring of 1937. She said yes. Nellie's throat closed. She said yes. For 3 weeks, she wore his ring for 3 weeks. I was the only one she told the whole story to afterward, and I have kept it inside me for 40 years because she asked me to. But you have her face, child, and you are sitting in front of me, and the man is at your fence telling you to ask, so I will tell you. Iona's hands were still folded in her lap. Her voice did not waver. 3 weeks into the engagement, your mother went up to the Booth farm to have supper with Harlan and his father. The father was a hard man, older Booth. He had run that farm with an iron hand for 50 years, and he had opinions about everything, and at supper that night, he made it plain to your mother what kind of wife she would be expected to be. She would not keep bees. She would not graft trees. She would not write to the agricultural papers. She would not, the old man said, embarrass the Booth name with women's foolishness. She would keep a house and raise sons and be quiet. Iona paused. Harlan said nothing. The whole supper, while his father laid out the terms of her future, Harlan sat at the table and ate his beef stew and said nothing. Your mother gave him back the ring on the front porch when supper was over. She said she could not marry a man who would not speak for her at his own father's table. She said she did not need a man who would speak for her. She said she needed a man who would stand beside her while she spoke for herself. Nellie closed her eyes. He never forgave her, Iona said. That was the wound. Not that she refused him. Men get refused. They survive it. The wound was that she had named the thing he could not do, named it on a porch in front of God and the night air, and he could not unhear it. He spent the next 20 years proving her wrong by refusing to let her be right about anything. The agricultural council was his. The seed market was his. The wagon yards in the village were his. Every time your mother brought an idea forward, Harlan Booth sat on the council and voted no, and the council voted with him because he was the council. Every time she tried to sell apples in the village, the buyers had already been spoken to. Every time she went to a barn raising, the men were busy. By the time the fire blight came in 48, she was already half isolated, and when she saved her own trees and proved the council wrong, he turned the screw harder. Iona's voice did not change. It was very quiet. Your mother caught pneumonia in January of 54. She had been walking to the village in the snow for 3 winters by then, because no one in this end of the valley would hitch a wagon for her. 3 miles, child, in the snow, with a basket of mending or a sack of apples on her back. The day she fell sick, she had walked into Rutland to deliver shirts she had sewn for a man in town. Her boots had holes in them. She walked back in wet boots. By the time she got home, the fever was on her. She died in the back room of her sister's house 6 days later. You know that part.
I know that part.
What you do not know is that on the second day of the fever, when she was still clear in her head, she made me promise 2 things. The first promise was that I would not tell you any of this until you were strong enough to use it and not be poisoned by it. The second promise was that I would give you a notebook she had kept when the time came. She did not say how I would know the time. She said I would know. Iona looked at Nellie steadily. I know now.
She rose stiffly from her chair and went into the cabin. Nellie sat on the porch and looked at the creek and the kingfisher and the low June sun, and she did not move. She could not have moved if the porch had caught fire under her. Inside the cabin, she could hear Iona opening a chest, lifting something out, setting something down. After a long time, the old woman came back to the porch with a leather-bound notebook in her hands. The cover was darker than the one already on Nellie's mantle. The leather rubbed smooth at the corners by years of handling. "This is the second one," Iona said. "She kept 2. The one in your house has the apple trees and the bees and the recipes. This one has the ideas she did not show anyone. She gave this one to me on the 3rd day of the fever and told me to keep it until you needed it. I have kept it for 3 years and 4 months. Iona laid the notebook in Nellie's hands. "I am not going to sit with you while you read it. You need to read it alone." That is the way she wanted it. "I am going inside to finish my peas, and you are going to walk home with this in your apron, and you are going to read it tonight after your husband is asleep, and tomorrow you are going to come back here and tell me what you found. That is the shape of it. Go on now. Go on." She turned and went inside, and the screen door slapped shut behind her, and the kingfisher rose from the far bank in a flash of blue and dropped down the creek and was gone. Nellie walked home with the notebook pressed against her ribs under the apron, and the willow walls of the duck lanes were standing in the eastern field in the slant evening light. And Thaddeus was at the barn pumping water for the horses, and the ducks were muttering in the back pasture, and the world was the same world it had been that morning, and nothing in it was the same at all. The ducks went into the lanes the next day. She had thought in the years afterward that this would be the part she remembered best from that summer, the morning she opened the gates and turned 63 half-blind birds loose into the strangest machine the valley had ever built. But in the event, she could barely keep her mind on it. The notebook was waiting for her on the mantel under her mother's other notebook, the 2 of them stacked like a sentence she had not yet read all the way through. She had not opened the second one yet. She was going to open it that night. She had promised Iona, and she had promised herself, and the promise was sitting in her chest like a held breath. The ducks did exactly what she had feared they would do.
They sat down in confusion. They pressed their breasts against the willow walls and pushed as though they might walk through them. A few of them, the boldest, blundered forward a step or two and then sat down again. Thaddeus stood at the gate with his arms folded and said nothing, which was his way of not saying, "I told you so." Nellie walked down the first lane, slowly scattering a little cracked corn ahead of each bird, drawing it forward by smell and sound. A duck that cannot see far has a fine nose and quick ears, and these ducks, she remembered, had been raised in narrow pens at Cornell since they were ducklings. They knew how to work close ground. They had simply forgotten in the months at the failed Marsden place that close ground was where they belonged. She got the first duck moving by the end of the first hour. By the end of the first afternoon, she had a dozen of them, shuffling slowly up and down the lanes, bills to the ground, snuffling the dirt, in a way that any other farmer in the valley would have called pathetic, and Nellie called precise. By the end of the second day, the rest of the flock had remembered. By the end of the third day, they were walking the lanes like familiar halls, turning at the gates, finding the water pans, settling at dusk when Nellie whistled them into the pen. The larvae were not safe anywhere a duck could reach. A larva that hatched and crawled the base of a stalk met a bill. A larva that dropped from an upper leaf jarred loose by wind or by Thaddeus walking the row shaking the plants met a bill before it could get its bearings. Nellie stood at the field's edge on the fourth evening and watched her 63 birds working the rows in the long blue light. And the field was quieter than it should have been at that time of year, because the beetles were not winning. She read the second notebook that night. Thaddeus had gone to bed early. His ear was bad again, the way it always went bad when the weather turned humid, and he had taken 2 aspirin and lain down with a hot cloth pressed over the left side of his head. Nellie sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned low and the notebook open in front of her, and she read slowly, because the handwriting was her mother's handwriting, and every page was like a room she was walking into for the first time. The notebook was almost entirely about ideas Cora had never tested. There were sketches for a hand-pulled cultivator that would work between narrow rows. There were notes on a method of pruning grapevines that Cora had read about in a Dutch agricultural journal and wanted to try. There were 3 pages on what Cora called rotational poultry, where chickens and ducks were moved between cropland and fallow ground in a deliberate pattern, the birds eating insects and fertilizing the soil as they went. There were diagrams. There were measurements. There were costs in pencil totaled and retotaled in the margins. In the back of the notebook on a page dated November 1953, Nellie found what she had come for. Her mother had drawn a rough sketch of 3 potato rows. Between the rows, she had drawn narrow lanes walled with what looked like woven willow. Inside the lanes, she had drawn ducks small and squat and unmistakable. Above the sketch in Cora's slanted hand was a paragraph. Read an article in last month's Farmer's Bulletin about a Dutch grower who used confined geese to control caterpillars in cabbage. The birds work the ground at the base of the plants where the larvae hatch. The trick is to keep the birds in narrow runs so they cannot wander. I think it would work for potato beetle. The birds would not need to see far. They would only need to be close to the work. I am writing to the Agricultural Council to propose a trial. I doubt they will answer. If they do not, perhaps Nellie will try one day. The child has the eye for it. Below the paragraph, Cora had written one more line. She is the one who will finish what I could not. Nellie put her forehead down on her arms on the kitchen table, and she cried without sound for a long time. She cried for her mother in the snow on the road to Rutland. She cried for the council that had said no. She cried for the 23 years of silence she had not known about. She cried for the woman she had been before Iona Whitcomb laid this notebook in her hands, and for the woman she was now, and for the woman she was going to have to become before the summer was out. When she could lift her head again, she closed the notebook gently and carried both notebooks together to the mantel and set them side by side and stood looking at them for a long time. "Mama," she said aloud, very softly, "you waited." The kitchen was warm. The lamp was low. In the back pasture, the ducks were quiet. In the eastern field, in the lanes, the willow walls were standing. "I am here now," she said. "I came." The trouble began 3 days later. It came first as weather, the way trouble often comes in Vermont. A line of thunderstorms walked down the spine of the Green Mountains on a Friday afternoon, and the first one hit Cedar Hollow at supper time, and by midnight, the eastern field was under 3 inches of standing water. The lanes Nellie had angled so carefully for drainage could not carry it all. The water pans overflowed and ran together. The willow walls held mostly, but one stretch along the southern edge of the field sagged where the cedar stakes had pulled loose in the soaked ground, and 3 of the ducks blundered through the gap and out into the open field in the dark. Thaddeus went out at 1 in the morning with the lantern and his good ear cocked into the wind. He came back 2 hours later, soaked to the waist, with the 3 ducks tucked muddy and complaining under his arms. One of them had nearly made the creek before he caught it. The creek was running high and brown and fast. A blind duck in that water would have been gone in a minute. He set the ducks back in the pen and braced the willow walls with fresh stakes in the dark and the rain, and he did not come into the house until 3. Nellie sat at the kitchen table with the lamp burning and did not sleep until he was inside and dry. In the morning, the storm was past, but the field was a mire, and a third of the eastern run of lanes was sagging where the boards had swelled and split. Nellie walked the field at first light and added up the damage and felt the first cold drop of real fear since the beetles had hatched. The contraption that made the blind ducks useful was itself fragile. Weather alone could undo it. That was the first wave. The second wave came 2 days later, and it was Harlan Booth's wave, and it was worse. He did not come back to the fence. He did not need to. He sat at the long counter of the feed store in the village in the chair he always sat in, and he talked to the men who came in for grain and twine and nails. He talked the way he always talked, calm and reasonable. the voice of the largest farmer in the county. He did not insult the Pickards. Harlan Booth never insulted anyone. He worried about them. He wondered aloud where exactly the Pickard ducks had come from. He had heard, he said, that they had come up from a research barn in New York. Federal research. The kind of research that had been going on quietly all over the country since the war. He did not say what kind of research. He did not have to. The men at the feed store filled in the rest themselves. Atomic, chemical, government, Cornell. The words bounced from kitchen to kitchen across the valley like stones skipped across a pond. By the end of the week, a woman in the village would not let her children walk past the Pickard lane. By the end of the next week, the Methodist minister, a worried thin man named Reverend Tolliver, came up the lane in his black coupe and stood on the porch with his hat in his hands and asked Nellie very kindly whether she would consider letting the county agricultural agent come out and inspect the flock. "For everyone's peace of mind," he said, "there has been talk." "What kind of talk?" "That the birds carry something from their previous life." "They don't." "I am sure they don't, but you understand. The talk is the trouble, not the birds. If the county agent comes out and writes a clean report, the talk ends." Nellie stood on the porch in her work apron and looked at the minister and understood in that moment that the county agent worked under the Agricultural Council, and the Agricultural Council was Harlan Booth's council. And the report the county agent wrote would say whatever the council wanted it to say. She thanked the minister for his concern. She told him she would think about it. She watched him drive away down the lane. That afternoon, she walked 4 miles down the valley road to a telephone at the general store in the village, and she placed a long-distance call to a veterinary clinic in Burlington, whose name she had found in the back of a feed catalog. She asked for the oldest veterinarian on the staff. A woman's voice on the other end asked her business. Nellie said she had 63 ducks and she needed an independent examination, and she was prepared to pay for the trip. The voice asked her how she meant to pay. "I'll bring the money in cash when the doctor comes. Tell him to name his fee." "That is unusual, Mrs." "I know." She walked home with her shoes hurting her. She did not tell Thaddeus about the call. She went into the bedroom and opened the small wooden box on the dresser where she kept her few pieces of jewelry, and she took out her mother's wedding ring. It was a thin gold band with a chip of garnet set in a simple bezel. Cora had worn it for 34 years. Nellie wrapped it in a square of clean linen and put it in her apron pocket. The veterinarian came on a Wednesday morning. His name was Dr. Linus Hatch, and he was 67 years old, a heavy-set man with white side whiskers and the careful, gentle hands of a man who had spent his life on animals. He examined every one of the 63 ducks. He drew blood from 12 of them at random. He took feather samples and dropping samples and water samples from the pans. He stayed at the farm for 6 hours. By the end of it, Thaddeus had come out of the barn and was standing in the yard watching, because he had not known Nellie had called the man, and he understood now that she had done it without him, and he was working out in his slow, patient way how he felt about that. At the end of the examination, Dr. Hatch washed his hands at the pump and dried them on a clean towel and accepted a cup of coffee on the porch and looked at Nellie steadily.
Your birds are sound misses, every one of them. They cannot see well, that is true, but they are not sick. They are not carrying any disease I can identify, and they are not, to use the word that has apparently been going around your valley, contaminated by anything. There is nothing in this flock that would harm a child or a crop or a well. I will write that in a letter to your county agricultural agent. I will write it in plain English so no one can twist it. Nellie nodded. She took the linen-wrapped ring out of her apron pocket and laid it on the table next to the doctor's coffee cup. This is what I have for your fee. The doctor looked at the ring. He did not touch it. Mrs. It was my mother's. I am told it's worth about $22. Mrs., listen to me. He folded his big hands on the table. I came up here at the request of a woman who called my office sounding like she meant business. I told my secretary I would name my fee when I arrived. I am naming it now. The fee is nothing. Put your mother's ring back in the box. Nellie's throat closed. I cannot accept the trip for nothing. You will accept it because I have something to tell you, and the telling is part of what I came up here to do. He paused. He looked out across the yard at the eastern field and the willow lanes and the 63 ducks working the rows in the morning sun. 3 days ago, a man called my office. He did not give his name at first, but my secretary recognized the voice. He had called the clinic 2 summers ago about a sick bull. The man on the line offered me $120 to come up to a farm in Cedar Hollow, examine a flock of ducks, and find something wrong with them. He told me what to look for. He said he did not care what I wrote as long as it would worry the Agricultural Council. He said he was prepared to pay in cash on the day. Nellie was very still. I told him I would think about it. I told him to call back in 2 days. I did not tell him I had already received a call from a young woman who wanted an honest examination. I have spent 51 years in this work, Mrs. I have not been bought yet. I am not going to start at 67. He took a long sip of his coffee. The man's name is Harlan Booth. I am writing it down in my notes, and I am putting it in the letter I will send to your county agricultural agent. The letter will say that the flock is sound, and that the examination was paid for honestly by the owner. It will not say what Harlan Booth offered me. That is for you to use as you see fit, or not. Some weapons are stronger sheathed. He set his cup down. Put the ring away, Mrs. Wear it on a chain around your neck if you're afraid of losing it, but do not give it to me. I would not sleep with it in my pocket. He stood up to go. At the door of the porch, he turned back. You have your mother's eye for a problem. I do not know your mother, but I know what an eye looks like when I see one. Hers must have been a hard one to live without. He nodded to her and walked down the steps to his truck and drove away down the lane in a slow cloud of June dust. Nellie stood on the porch for a long time. The linen-wrapped ring was still on the table. The coffee cup was still warm in her hand. The 63 ducks were still working the rows in the eastern field. The willow walls were still standing. She picked up the ring and walked into the house and put it back in the wooden box on the dresser. That night, after Thaddeus had gone to bed, she sat at the kitchen table and took both of her mother's notebooks down from the mantel and laid them in front of her. She did not open them. She just sat with her hands on the leather covers and looked at the lamp and worked out slowly what kind of woman she was going to have to be for the rest of the summer. She thought about the Agricultural Council in 1948 and the men who had voted no. She thought about the snow on the road to Rutland in the winter of 1954. She thought about Harlan Booth sitting at his father's supper table in the spring of 1937, eating beef stew, saying nothing while a man laid out the terms of her mother's future. She thought about a chip of garnet on a thin gold band and a doctor with white side whiskers who had not been bought. She thought about 63 half-blind ducks in the dark of the back pasture settling in for the night, asking nothing of her, except that she keep them where the work was. Then she got up from the table, blew out the lamp, and went to bed. In the deep, small hours of the morning, somewhere out past the willow lanes and the southern edge of the field near the gate of the back pasture where the ducks slept, a boot pressed down into the soft June ground and pressed up again, and then another, and then another. The prints filled slowly with water in the dark and did not freeze because June in Vermont is too warm for freezing. They sat there waiting for the morning sun, and the sun did not come for 3 hours yet. But in the morning, Nellie Pickard would walk out to feed her birds at first light, and she would see them, and the summer would turn again. The boot prints were 5 steps from the gate of the back pasture, pressed deep into the soft mud where the ground sloped down toward the willow lanes. Nellie saw them when she came out at first light with the feed bucket in her hand. She stopped at the top of the slope and set the bucket down very carefully and crouched and studied the prints. 2 boots, a man's boots by the size. Wide at the toe, narrow at the heel, the right boot worn deeper on the outside edge than the left. The man who wore those boots walked with a slight lean to his right side. The prints came up from the southern end of the field, past the willow walls to within 5 paces of the pen gate, and then they turned and went back the way they had come. Whoever had stood there had stood a long time. The prints were deeper at the gate end than at the field end, the way prints sink when a person stands and waits. Nellie picked up the feed bucket and walked the rest of the way to the pen and let the ducks out into the lanes as if it were any other morning. She did not run back to the house. She did not call for Thaddeus. She fed the birds and filled the water pans and walked the rows slowly turning leaves, and only when she was sure she could keep her voice steady did she go back to the kitchen. Thaddeus was at the table with his coffee. "Someone was at the pen gate in the night," she said. He set the cup down. "How do you know?" "Boot prints in the mud, 5 steps from the gate." He stood and watched, and then he turned around and went back. He didn't open it. "No,"
The gate is the way I left it. The chain is set. Cora's bell. It didn't ring. He didn't get close enough.
Thaddeus rubbed his jaw slowly. The bell had been Nellie's idea 2 weeks earlier after she had read the agricultural agent's letter and understood what Harlan Booth was prepared to spend to make her fail. She had walked out to the pen one evening with a length of fishing line and a small brass cowbell she had found in a drawer, and she had strung the line low across the path to the gate knee-high and tied the bell to the line where it would ring if anyone came through. She had not told Thaddeus what she was doing because Thaddeus did not need another worry pressed into the long night of his bad ear.
He didn't trip it, Thaddeus said. He didn't come that close. He stopped at 5 paces. He stood and watched. He was looking at how the pen is built. Counting the ducks, maybe? Or counting the gates? They looked at each other across the table. I'm not going to the constable, Nellie said. Not yet. The constable in Cedar Hollow drinks coffee at Harlan Booth's table on Sunday mornings. By the time the constable got out here, the prince would be gone, and the story would be different. What do you want to do? I want to set a second bell, out past the first one closer to the south fence. I want to know if he comes back, and I want you not to stand watch with me. You need to sleep. Your ear is bad. If he comes again, I will hear him before I hear anything else, and I will wake you, and we will go together. But not before. Thaddeus did not argue. He had learned by then that when Nellie spoke that way, with the words coming out flat and laid down in order like stones in a wall, the time for arguing had passed. He nodded slowly. All right. All right. She set the second bell that afternoon. She set it just inside the south fence line where a man coming up from the road on foot would have to step across it to reach the field. She tied the line to 2 cedar stakes she drove into the ground herself, low and tight, and she covered the bell with a tuft of long grass so it would not be seen unless a person was looking right at it. Then she walked back to the house and washed her hands and made supper, and did not tell Thaddeus where the second bell was. That was the change in her that week. Something had hardened. Something had gone from waiting to choosing. She had been carrying the 2 notebooks for a long time now, and she had been carrying the doctor's letter, and she had been carrying her mother's silence. And somewhere in the carrying, she had stopped being a woman who hoped and started being a woman who decided. The first beetle wave broke in the 3rd week of June. The hatch had been heavy, but the ducks had held the bottom of the field. By the end of June, the lower leaves of the plants were almost clean. The trouble had moved upward the way it always did onto the upper leaves where the blind birds could not reach. Thaddeus and Nellie spent the long, heavy days walking the rows together, shaking the plants so the larvae rained down into the dirt where the ducks could find them. It was brutal work. Thaddeus's bad ear made him dizzy in the heat, and Nellie's back was a single bar of fire by mid-morning, and they took turns sitting in the shade of the willow walls to drink water and chew bread and not look at each other so they would not have to admit how tired they were. In the second week of the wave, on the worst day, Nellie sat down in the dirt of a lane at noon and could not get up again. Thaddeus found her there 10 minutes later. She was sitting with her back against the willow wall and her hands flat on the ground and her eyes closed. He knelt next to her. "Nellie." "I'm all right." "You're not." "I'm tired." "You haven't eaten enough in 3 days. You haven't slept in 5. She opened her eyes. "Then we lose." "We don't lose. We slow down." "We can't slow down. The upper leaves are bad. If we slow down by 1 day, the upper leaves are gone and the lower leaves come back. The whole thing only works if we don't slow down." Thaddeus sat down in the dirt next to her. He put his back against the willow wall and stretched out his long legs. "Then sit with me a minute. 5 minutes. The ducks will keep working. The beetles aren't going anywhere." She let her head fall sideways onto his shoulder. He smelled like sweat and tobacco and the cedar dust that had soaked into the cuffs of his shirts since they had moved to the farm. She closed her eyes. "Thad." "Yes." "Why don't you ever doubt me?" "I doubt you sometimes." "You don't say it." "I doubted you in the rain that night the lane sagged. I told you to sell the birds. You took the lamp and you walked me out to the field, and you turned the leaves over one by one, and you showed me you were right. I have not doubted you since. I'm asking you why." He thought about it for a long time. The June sun was coming down on the field through the gaps in the willow walls, and the shadows of the leaves were moving on the ground. "At the mine," he said, "in the spring of '53, a young man named Wendell Carmichael was hired on the crew under me. He was 19. He read books. He had been to 1 year of teachers' college in Castleton before his father died, and he had to come home and earn. He worked under me for about 6 weeks. He had an idea about the south shaft. He had a way of bracing it he had read about somewhere. He came to me with it on a Tuesday morning in March. He had drawn it out on a piece of butcher paper. I looked at it and told him it was clever, and I told him we did not have the time or the lumber to try it. I told him to get back to work. 3 days later, the south shaft came down on him and on 2 other men. The bracing he had drawn out on the butcher paper would have caught the fall. I am as sure of that as I am of anything in my life. I dug for 2 hours, and I pulled my foreman out by his belt, and I could not pull Wendell out. He was under the worst of it. I have not slept a full night in 4 years. He paused. You came into the church supper at Rutland in August of '54, 6 months after the mine, and I watched you eat a piece of pie at the long table, and I watched you look at the woman across from you the way you look at a thing. I thought that is Wendell's look. That is the look of a person who sees the thing other people walk past. I sat down next to you. I asked you your name. I told myself in that moment, Thaddeus, if you ever doubt this woman,
The way you doubted that boy. You have learned nothing from anything that ever happened to you in your life. So I do not doubt you. Not because you are always right, because doubting you is a kind of forgetting I cannot afford.
Nellie did not lift her head from his shoulder. She did not open her eyes. The tears went down her face very quietly, the way water goes down a stone. "All right," she said. "All right. 5 more minutes. Take 10. She took 10. Then she got up and went back to the rose. The second bell rang on a Friday night. It was almost 2 in the morning when Nellie sat up in bed. The house was dark, and the window was open to the warm summer dark. And somewhere down the field, faint and clear, she had heard a small brass note like a struck spoon. She put her hand on Thaddeus's shoulder. "Thad." He came awake all at once, the way he always came awake, the slate miner in him still living somewhere under the surface. "The south bell." "Yes." They went out the back door without a lamp. The moon was up and full enough to see by. The field was silver, and the willow lanes were charcoal lines across the silver. They crossed the yard barefoot in the wet grass and stopped at the corner of the barn and listened. Down at the south fence, 20 paces inside the line, a dark shape was crouched in the grass. It was not moving. It had stopped at the bell. It had heard the ring. It had heard them too, maybe the small sounds of 2 people coming out of a house in the night. It was deciding. Nellie stepped forward. "Come up out of there." The shape did not move. "I see you. The moon is full. You stepped on a wire and rang a bell. Come up. Show me your face." The shape rose slowly out of the grass. It was tall and thin and young. It walked up the slope toward them with its hands held out to its sides, palms open. He stopped 6 paces from the porch. The moonlight was on his face. He was 19 years old. He had the pale blue eyes of his father and the high forehead of his father and the same long, thin frame, except where Harlan Booth carried himself, like a length of split rail. This boy carried himself like a length of split rail somebody had bent. His shoulders were not square. He looked at Nellie with the eyes of a person who had been walking up this slope in his head for weeks and was finally getting it over with. "My name is Ezra Booth," he said. "I know who you are. I came to talk. At 2 in the morning. I could not come in the day. He would see me leave." Thaddeus was very still beside her. Nellie did not look at him. She looked at the boy. "Talk." Ezra Booth lowered his hands slowly. "He sent me here a week ago, to the back pasture, to stand at the gate and look at how the pen is set. He told me he would do it himself, but his knee is bad, and the walk over the ridge in the dark would lay him up. He told me to count the ducks and look at the chain on the gate and see if the chain was the kind that could be cut. He told me to come home and report. I did what he told me. I came home and reported. The chain is the kind that can be cut. I am supposed to come back tomorrow night with the cutters. Nellie did not move. And I cannot do it. I have been trying for a week. I have been telling myself I could. I cannot. So I came tonight to ring whatever bell you set, because I knew you had set one. I have read about you in my room with the door closed for 6 weeks. I have read every back issue of the Farmer's Bulletin we have in the house. I have read about Cornell. I know what the ducks are. I know what you are doing. He does not know what you are doing. He thinks you are a fool with a strange idea. I think you are going to win, and I think when you win, he will lose more than the crop. He will lose the thing he has been holding on to for 40 years. The boy's voice did not waver. It was not the voice of a boy. It was the voice of a person who had been writing the speech down in his head every night for a long time. I am here to tell you he will send me back tomorrow night. I am here to tell you I will not come. I am here to tell you he will send someone else if I refuse, because that is what he does. I am here to ask you what you want me to do. Nellie looked at Ezra Booth for a long time in the moonlight. She thought about her mother on the porch of the Booth farm in the spring of 1937, handing back a ring. She thought about a young man at a long supper table, eating beef stew, saying nothing. She thought about how things repeat across the generations, parent to child, and how they sometimes break. "Come up on the porch," she said. "We are going to make coffee, and then we are going to talk about your father." She did not know yet, standing in the moonlight, that the fox was already coming. The fox was on the move that very night, working the south end of the valley hungry, drawn by the smell of penned poultry on the warm summer air. It would not arrive at the Pickard farm for 3 more nights. But it was coming, and no bell in the world would stop it, because foxes do not step on wires. The fox came on Monday night. It came from the back up the creek bed the way no human would come. It worked the back fence of the pasture for an hour looking for a weak place. It found one where the cedar stakes had pulled loose in the heavy June rains and never been reset because Nellie and Thaddeus had been too tired and too consumed with the upper leaves to walk the back fence. The fox slipped through the gap. It killed 2 ducks before they made a sound. The 3rd duck cried out, and the cry woke the flock, and the flock erupted, and the noise reached Nellie at 3 in the morning through the open window. She was up before she knew she was awake. She had a lamp lit and the back door open, and she was running across the wet grass in her nightdress before Thaddeus had his boots on. The fox was gone by the time she got to the pasture. It had taken 1 duck with it, the 3rd one, and it had killed 2 more in the panic and left them. The rest of the flock had burst out through the open gate of the pen, the gate that Nellie had unchained on her way through, and the Willow Lane gates were not all closed because the system was built for daytime work and not for nighttime panic. 60 birds, half blind in absolute terror, were now scattered across 3 acres of dark field. By the time Thaddeus reached her with the second lamp, a third of the eastern lane system was trampled flat, where the panicked ducks had blundered into the willow walls. Nellie sat down in the wet grass at the edge of the pasture. She sat down hard. The lamp tipped sideways in her hand. Thaddeus took it from her gently and set it upright. Nellie, it's 2 days before the last of the hatch finishes. 2 days, and the lanes are gone, a third of them gone. We rebuild. We cannot rebuild in 2 days. We cannot find the ducks in 2 days. We cannot do this in 2 days, Thad. We have done it. We have lost it. He sat down in the grass beside her. He did not argue with her. He had learned not to argue with her when the math was the math. They sat in the wet grass with the 2 lamps burning between them and the field full of scattered, terrified birds. And somewhere off to the east, the first thin gray edge of morning was coming up over the ridge. After a long time, Nellie wiped her face with the back of her wrist. Wait, she said. Thaddeus did not move. The lanes were teaching them, she said. The lanes were never the work. The lanes were teaching them where the work was. The lanes were the walls of the school. They have been in school for a month. They know where the work is. They know what the whistle is. They know what the cracked corn means. The lanes are gone, but the school is finished. She looked at her husband.
We don't rebuild. We herd. 60 birds, 2 of us, 3 with Ezra. The boy is coming at dawn. I told him to come at dawn. We get the long willow switches Thad cut for fences, and we walk the rows ourselves, and we drive the ducks in front of us in a loose flock. They snuffle as they go. They eat what is at the base of every plant we pass. We move them down one row and up the next. We don't need the walls anymore. The ducks know the work. Thaddeus was already on his feet. He had pulled her up by both wrists before she had finished speaking. Get the whistle. Yes. I will start gathering them. You go find the whistle. Where is Ezra? He said dawn. The road from his father's farm is 3 miles. He will be on it now. Then we have help in an hour. Go. She went. She found the whistle on the nail by the kitchen door, the small brass whistle she had bought in the village in May and used every day since. She came back across the yard at a run. Thaddeus was already in the pasture with the first lamp, talking low and steady to the ducks, the way you talk to a horse gathering them in a slow, loose group around his knees with handfuls of cracked corn. Nellie blew the whistle in the dark, the whistle the ducks had heard every day for 6 weeks, the whistle that meant food and safety, and the pen at dusk, and the lanes at dawn, the whistle their blind world was organized around. The ducks heard it. They were terrified, and they were scattered, and they could not see. But they heard the whistle, and a duck that has been trained to a sound for 6 weeks is a duck that will walk toward that sound through any kind of fear. They came, one by one,
and then in twos, and then in threes, and then in a loose, snuffling raft drawn out of the broken lanes and up from the pasture, and in from the far end of the field, drawn by Thaddeus's voice and Nellie's whistle, until the whole scattered flock was bunched and shivering and warm against the legs of two exhausted people in the gray edge of morning. Ezra Booth came up the lane at 5:30. He had walked the 3 miles from his father's house in the dark. He came around the corner of the barn at the sound of the whistle and stopped when he saw the flock and the 2 people and the trampled lanes beyond them.
"You came," Nellie said. "I said I would." "Can you whistle?" "Yes." "Can you walk a row slow and watch where a duck's bill is going?" "Yes."
"Then take this." She handed him a long, peeled willow switch Thaddeus had cut for fence work and never used. "You walk the back of the flock. Thaddeus walks the front. I walk the middle. We move them down the first row at the eastern edge, and we work back across the field, row by row. We have 2 days. We have 60 birds. We have a job that does not require lanes anymore. Do you understand me? I understand you." Then we begin. They began. What happened in the next 2 days at the Pickard farm in the eastern field of 3 acres of potato rows in Cedar Hollow, Vermont, in the last week of June 1957, was a thing that nobody in the valley saw, because nobody in the valley came to look. The Pickards were finished after all. The fox had come. The lanes were down. The story was over. The men in the village waited for the official announcement of the lost crop, which they expected by the end of the week, and they did not waste a trip out to the cold end of the valley to confirm what they already knew. What they did not see was 3 people walking the rows from sunrise to sunset, 2 days running, driving a loose, snuffling raft of 60 blind ducks ahead of them in a slow, careful sweep down one row and up the next. Thaddeus, at the front of the flock, his long arms out to either side, his bad ear cocked into the wind, keeping the lead birds from drifting. Nellie in the middle with the whistle and a handful of cracked corn she scattered every dozen paces to keep the flock moving forward. Ezra at the back, the tall, thin 19-year-old boy who had walked away from his father's house in the dark, his willow switch held low and steady, gently turning back any duck that lagged. Above them, the upper leaves swayed in the noon heat, and Thaddeus shook each plant in his path as he passed, so the last of the larvae rained down into the dirt, where the ducks found them snapping bills in the close ground exactly the way they had been taught. By the end of the first day, the eastern half of the field had been swept. By the end of the second day, the western half had been swept. By the evening of the second day, the upper leaves were stripped of larvae, and the lower leaves were clean, and the field stood green from soil to crown. 3 acres of it, untouched and whole, while around them in every direction in the valley, the other potato fields were skeletal and bare, and the men who farmed them stood at the edges and did not know what to do. Nellie walked the rows one final time on the second evening in the falling light. She turned leaves top and bottom. She checked the joints of the stalks. She crouched at the base of every plant for 10 paces of every row. She found nothing. No eggs, no larvae, no striped backs. The field had held. She walked back to the house slowly in the long blue dusk. Thaddeus was on the porch with Ezra. They had bread and cheese and a pitcher of cold milk between them on the rail. They both looked up when she came through the gate. "Done," Thaddeus said. "Done." He took a long breath. He nodded once. He put his hand on Ezra's shoulder briefly, a thing Nellie had never seen him do to anyone before. Then he went back to his bread. Ezra Booth did not eat. He looked at Nellie across the porch. "What do you want me to do now?" "You go home. He will know I was here." "Yes. He will throw me out. He may." "Then where do I go?" "Tomorrow at the agricultural fair, you will stand next to me when your father comes to see the field. You will not speak. You will not need to. I will speak. After that, you may sleep in the back room of this house until you have made your own arrangement. We have a back room. Thaddeus does not snore on Tuesdays." Thaddeus, around a mouthful of bread, said, "I do not snore." "He does not snore," Nellie said. "Go home, Ezra. Sleep if you can. Come back at noon tomorrow." The boy stood up. He was unsteady. He looked at her with the pale blue eyes that were his father's eyes, and were not his father's eyes at all. "My mother died when I was 4 years old," he said. "I do not remember her face. I have been waiting for somebody to tell me what to do for 15 years. I did not think it would be the woman my father has been talking about for 6 months. I am not telling you what to do. You are. You are telling me to stand next to you in the sun tomorrow. You can refuse. I am not going to refuse." He walked down the steps of the porch and across the yard and out the gate and down the lane, and the dusk took him. Thaddeus watched him go. Then he looked at Nellie. "He is going to be the price." Yes, his father will not forgive him. No. Are you all right with that? "I am all right with it," Nellie said, "because the boy is already the price. He paid the price the night he rang my second bell. Tomorrow is just the part where it shows." She sat down on the porch step and took the pitcher of milk in both hands and drank deeply from the rim of it because there were no clean cups left in the kitchen. And Thaddeus watched her in the falling light, and the field behind them stood green and whole, and the summer was almost over. The agricultural fair was held the last Saturday of August on the grounds of the Cedar Hollow Grange Hall, in the village the same as it had been every August since 1889. The men of the valley came in from their dead fields and stood around the pens and the produce tables and did not talk much because there was not much to say. Half the county had lost the crop. Harlan Booth stood at the center of a small, quiet circle of older farmers and accepted their condolences as if they were his condolences too. because his seed had been their seed, and his advice had been their advice, and the failure was however gently he carried himself about it, his failure as well. The talk turned around 11 in the morning to the Pickard farm. It was Bert Halloran who started it. Bert had been quiet about the Pickards since the fox night. He had assumed, like everyone else, that the lanes had fallen and the crop had gone, because that was the story the valley had been telling itself. But Bert had ridden past the Pickard lane the previous evening on his way home from a barn raising, and he had seen something through the willow fence at the cold end of the field that he had not believed. "Their field is green," he said in the middle of the quiet circle. The men around him did not react at first. "Their field is green," Bert said again. "All 3 acres. I rode past last night. The leaves are whole. There is no beetle damage I could see. The ducks are still working the rows. The Pickards did it." The circle was silent. I went up to the fence and stood there 10 minutes. There is no plant in that field that is not green. I have not seen a field that green in this valley since the spring. Harlan Booth did not move. The pale blue eyes did not blink. "Bert," he said quietly. "Yes, Harlan. You are mistaken. I am not Harlan. I rode past at 6 o'clock yesterday. The light was clear. I am not a man who imagines fields." The circle of farmers was looking at Harlan now. Harlan was looking at Bert. "Then perhaps," Harlan said in the same quiet voice, "we ought to ride over and look." By noon, there were 11 men on horseback in the lane outside the Pickard farm. They were the men of the Agricultural Council, and the men who had bought Harlan's seed, and the men who had laughed at Nellie in May, and the men who had not laughed but had not spoken either. They sat their horses in a loose line along the willow fence, and they looked into the eastern field, and the eastern field looked back at them. 3 acres of green. The ducks working the rows in the late August sun. The upper leaves whole. The lower leaves whole. Not one stripped plant in the whole field. Nellie came out of the house with her hair tied back and her work apron on. Thaddeus came out of the barn with the boy beside him. The 3 of them walked to the fence together. The men on horseback did not speak. Bert Halloran took his hat off. After a moment, 2 of the other men took theirs off too. After another moment, all 11 hats were off. Harlan Booth dismounted last. He walked to the fence slowly, his bad knee stiff under him. He stopped on the other side of the willow rail from Nellie. He looked at the field. He looked at the ducks. He looked at his son standing beside her, with the breadcrumbs of breakfast still on his shirt front. Then he looked at Nellie. Nellie did not wait for him to speak. "Mr. Booth, Mrs. Pickard, my mother wrote a letter to the Agricultural Council of Cedar Hollow in November of 1953. She proposed the trial of a method she had read about, a method using confined poultry to control potato beetle. She received no answer. She wrote the proposal in a notebook she kept by her bed. I have that notebook. It is on the mantel in my kitchen. I have read it many times this summer. You can read it too if you wish. The drawing she made of the lanes is on the back page. It is the same drawing I built in this field.
I built what she could not. The field stands.
Harlan Booth did not speak. My mother died in January of 1954 because no one in this end of the valley would lend her a wagon to go to Rutland in the snow. I have been told why. I have been told it took 20 years to get to that no wagon. I have been told who set the long quiet against her and why. The pale blue eyes did not look away. You do not owe me an apology, Mr. Booth. You did not harm me. You harmed her. She is in the cemetery at St. Andrew's Churchyard on the Rutland Road, in the third row from the back under a stone her sister bought. I will take you to that stone on Sunday at 3 o'clock in the afternoon if you wish to come. You can say to her what you have to say. I will stand at the gate and wait. I will not listen. That is between you and her. She paused. If you do not come on Sunday, I will understand. I will not speak of any of this again. I will not write a letter to the county paper. I will not tell my neighbors. The field will be its own answer, and that will be enough. But the invitation stands. 3 o'clock, Sunday, St. Andrew's, the third row from the back. Harlan Booth stood at the willow fence with his hat in his hand. The pale blue eyes were wet. 40 years of carefully held silence cracked across his face all at once, the way old ice cracks across a pond when the spring comes too suddenly. He could not speak. He could not have spoken if his life had depended on it. Bert Halloran, on his horse behind him, looked away to give him privacy. After a long time, Harlan Booth put his hat back on. He nodded once to Nellie. He turned and mounted his horse slowly, his bad knee catching on the stirrup. He rode down the lane without looking back. The 11 men followed him at a distance, none of them looking at each other, none of them speaking. Ezra Booth stayed at the fence. He stayed at the fence the rest of the afternoon. He stayed there at dusk when the ducks were brought in. He stayed there at dark when Nellie called him to the porch for supper. He came finally when she called him a second time, and he sat at the kitchen table and ate the soup she put in front of him, and he did not say anything for a long time, and then he put his spoon down and looked at her. He came on Sunday, Ezra said. We do not know yet whether he will come on Sunday. Sunday is 4 days away. He came, Ezra said. He came in his face today. I saw him come. Nellie looked at her husband across the table. Thaddeus, who had not slept properly in 3 months, who could no longer hear thunder in his left ear, who had said almost nothing the whole day at the fence, set his bread down and looked at the boy. Eat your soup, Thaddeus said. The rest sorts itself. Harlan Booth came on Sunday at 3. He came in his own buggy alone. He stopped at the gate of St. Andrew's Churchyard. Nellie was waiting there. She did not speak to him. She walked him to the third row from the back. She showed him the stone. The stone said only, Cora Thatcher, Pickard, 1909 to 1954, and below the name in smaller letters, Beloved Mother. There was nothing else on it. Cora's sister had paid for the stone out of her own savings, and there had not been money for more. Nellie left him at the stone. She walked back to the gate. She stood at the gate with her hands folded in front of her apron, and she did not look back. After about half an hour, Harlan Booth came down the path to the gate. His face was wet. He did not try to hide it. "Mrs. Pickard." "Mr. Booth."
"Your mother and I had a conversation," he said.
"I cannot tell you the shape of it. It belongs to her now. But I can tell you the end of it. I asked her if she would forgive me. I do not know what she answered. I think she answered, 'I do not feel forgiven. I feel something else. I feel like a man who has put down something he has been carrying for 40 years. Nellie nodded.
"I will not come to your farm again," he said. "I will not call at your fence. I will sell my place at the end of next year and go to my sister in Massachusetts. Ezra will have the Booth farm in his own name on the day I sign the papers. He is 19. He will need help. He will need a teacher. I am asking you to be that teacher, Mrs. Pickard. I am asking you to take the boy on and teach him what you know."
Nellie looked at the old man for a long time. "All right. Thank you."
He tipped his hat and got back into his buggy and drove away down the Rutland Road, and Nellie stood at the gate of St. Andrew's churchyard and watched him go until the buggy was a small, dark speck against the late August fields. And then she walked back to the third row from the back and stood by her mother's stone alone. "Mama," she said. The cemetery was quiet. A late bee was working a clover head by the path. The August sun was low and orange behind the maples on the western ridge.
"I came," Nellie said. "I finished it. I built the thing you drew. The field stands. The valley knows. The man came. I do not know if you wanted him to come. I brought him anyway because I thought you might want a chance. He brought himself in the end. I just opened the gate." She paused. "I am going to teach the boy. I think you would have done the same. He is 19 and his hands are good and his eye is starting to come in. I will give him what you gave me. I will give him the look that finds the thing nobody else can do." She put her hand flat on the top of the stone. "Thank you for the notebook, Mama. Thank you for waiting." She stood there until the sun was below the ridge. Then she walked to her wagon and drove home in the long blue dusk. And Thaddeus and Ezra were waiting on the porch with supper on the table, and the lamp was lit in the kitchen window, and the 60 ducks were quiet in the back pasture for the night, and the field stood green and whole in the August dark, the way her mother had drawn it on the back page of a notebook in November of 1953, on a page she had not lived to see come true. In the spring of 1958, the valley was full of willow lanes. Half the farms in Cedar Hollow had built their own version of the Pickard contraption over the winter, and half of those had walked up the Pickard Lane in February and March, asking Nellie to come and look at their work and tell them what they had built wrong. She came. She came to every farm that asked. She charged nothing. She brought Ezra with her, and Ezra carried a notebook of his own, now a leather-bound notebook with a brass clasp that Nellie had given him at Christmas. And in the notebook, Ezra wrote down everything Nellie said about lane width and willow weave and water pan depth and the right kind of whistle to train a duck to. Bert Halloran had built lanes. Reverend Tolliver, who did not farm but kept a kitchen garden, had built tiny lanes for 2 pet ducks his daughter had given him. Iona Whitcomb, who was 65 and slowing down, had not built lanes, but had given Nellie a long, careful afternoon at her kitchen table, going through every page of Cora's first notebook, with her naming the people Cora had mentioned in the margins, filling in the names of the dead. Harlan Booth sold his farm in November of 1958 and went to his sister in Pittsfield. Ezra Booth ran the place after that, with Nellie and Thaddeus driving over twice a week through the first year to help with the heavy work. The boy turned out to be a careful farmer. He had the eye, after all. It had been buried under his father for 19 years, and now it was coming up. In April of 1959, on a soft, warm morning, Nellie stood at the willow fence at the cold end of the valley, with Bert Halloran's youngest boy beside her. Bert's boy was 8 years old, sent over to learn the duck trick his father had laughed at 2 years before. The lanes ran fresh and straight down the green rows. New lumber now. Real lumber bought with the money from a record potato harvest the autumn before. The flock moved through the lanes snuffling and sure. "They can't hardly see," the boy said, doubtful the way the whole valley had once been doubtful. "No," Nellie said. "They can't see far at all." She put her hand on his shoulder. The same gesture Iona Whitcomb had once put on Cora Thatcher's shoulder 40 years earlier on a porch in the rain. The same gesture Cora had put on Nellie's shoulder 100 times in the apple orchard in Rutland before the fever took her. "But a thing doesn't have to be pretty to be worth keeping," Nellie said. "It only has to be good at the one thing nobody else can do." The boy nodded slowly. He was 8 years old, and he did not understand yet what he was hearing. He would understand later. He would carry the sentence forward into a life Nellie would never see. That was how it worked. That was how her mother had meant it to work when she had written it down in a notebook nobody had read for 3 years. The ducks worked the rows. The morning was warm. The field stood green from soil to crown, and somewhere east of the ridge, the long valley of Cedar Hollow, Vermont, opened out under the soft April sky, full of willow lanes and stubborn women, and the quiet, stubborn work of finishing what the dead had started.